Hey guys, what's up? My name is Public, and today I'm bringing you the 7.2.5 Shadow Priest preview video. We're going to go over all the changes to Shadow coming in 7.2.5, as well as show you some things on the PTR, and kind of look at Tomb of the Sargeras stuff, and that kind of thing. So this isn't going to be a very much like a where is Shadow going to be in tier 20, you know, how are they going to stack up or that kind of thing, but we are going to look at what's changing for Shadow. So if you're not paying attention to all the crazy PTR stuff that's happening, give you a little bit of a rundown of that, because there is some stuff that's changed for us. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to look at in this video is our new tier set. So with 7.2.5, we have a new tier coming out with patch 7.2.5, the Tomb of Sargeras is what, I guess 7.2 is that now, but the raid's actually coming in 7.2.5, and with that, we get tier 20. So a couple of things before I talk about this. Keep in mind, we have 6 pieces of tier for any given thing. So like with tier 19 right now, there are 6 slots that give us that tier bonus. Currently, that's staying the same with tier 20. There are 6 slots of tier. So what that means is we cannot use 4 piece of tier 19 and 4 piece of tier 20 at the same time. We can, however, use the 2 piece and 4 piece together. So it's a little kind of a mixed match and that kind of thing. Before I dive into what tier 20 actually is, a quick note, I know because tier 19 is actually quite popular. I think a lot of people love the 4 set, the mobility it brings, that kind of thing. That is actually getting nerfed once the patch drops. So right now, I think we can chant or cast Void Bolt freely at the start of our Void form for 4 seconds with tier 19. In the upcoming patch, that is getting reduced significantly. I believe it's 2.5 seconds, something like that. They'll probably keep tweaking it a little bit. But the important thing to note is the 4 piece is dropping quite significantly in value. So even if we wanted to run tier 4 piece, it's pretty much going to be drop it as soon as you can once the patch hits. So keep that in mind. Now, with that being said, the 2 piece of tier 19 is staying the same. It's when our Vampiric Touch does damage, we get Insanity, basically. That will still stay the same, but it's not very powerful as it stands right now. So there is a good chance they'll probably leave the 2 piece on for quite some time until we get really high eye level stuff to replace it. And that being said, it's really only super good on heavy multi-target, heavy cleave when we have multiple Vampiric Touches out. So because Tomb of Sargeras is a little bit more single target based, it's not going to be super important. However, I will say you want to get tier 19 tier. I would try and get as high of that tier as you can. So if you're kind of getting more into farm, whether you're on normal or heroic or whatever you are in the Nighthold right now, I would start using your bonus rolls just to get higher tier pieces to use, as close to the 925 cap as you can, because you know Tomb of Sargeras gear is significantly higher eye level. So if you want that 2 piece to remain relevant, kind of get bigger tiers so you don't have to go back in the Nighthold for whatever reason. All right. So now, after all that rambling's done with, let's go and look at tier 20. So tier 20 did get changed a couple times, but its current iteration is actually, it's pretty good. It gives us a great boost on single target, which is something that a lot of people have been asking for, and it's pretty nice. The 2 piece bonus you can see coming up now is that your Mind Flay damage increases the damage of your next Mind Blast by a percentage. Right now it's 3%, and its Insanity generation by 1. And this stacks 10 times. So essentially it's getting kind of into that a little bit of what tier 18 was doing, coming back into it a little bit with Mind Flay being a bit more important than it has in the past. So with this, we're not really changing our rotation too much to prioritize Mind Flay differently. Anything we really did in SimC to see this, it just never ended up working very well. So in terms of rotation, this doesn't really change. However, it is increasing the damage of Mind Blast a little bit, and giving our Legendary Belt a little bit more oomph as well. So overall, pretty solid 2 piece. I imagine for the start of progression especially, we'll probably end up using tier 19 4 piece or just the 2 piece with this. So you'll probably get this pretty early on. So not too bad. You can see the stacks are just a buff that you can track. I'll add this to my weak orders at some point once it's finalized. So yeah, it's pretty cut and dry. It's not a huge increase, but it's decent, and it doesn't really change our playstyle much. That's a good and bad thing, I guess. But the real kicker is the 4 piece bonus. So this was recently nerfed a little bit, probably more like a lot, but that's fine. This is still very powerful. So what it does is your Insanity drains 15% slower while in Void form. This is pretty good. This is essentially reverting a nerf that Shadow Priest had a couple patches ago that they compensated for in other ways. So they're kind of reverting that a little bit, which is kind of strange, but for all intents and purposes, this is pretty huge. We're looking at a pretty significant increase, like I said, on single target, and it's kind of just a flat, like, this is great for everything. This isn't like a single target tier bonus like tier 19 right now. The 4-piece lets us cast Void Bolts out. For all intents and purposes, that's pretty much just single target damage that it's getting you. Not only is this better than that on single target, but it also scales better across fights, which is great. One important thing to note here, with the recent change they did to this, while Insanity Drain's 15% slower, that's only true when you're taking Legacy of the Void or Shadow Crash as your level 100 talent. If you're taking Surrender to Madness, it's only 10% slower. So the tier piece actually is not as good for Surrender as it is the other two talents. What this essentially boils down to is Surrender is getting less oomph out of the tier than Legacy of the Void is or Shadow Crash is. So as far as we can tell right now, from a rating progression standpoint, we will still be taking Legacy of the Void since the tier set doesn't affect anything differently really. So if you were looking forward to maybe getting to use Surrender again in Tomb of Sargeras, the answer is probably not for progression, but maybe for farm, just like it kind of is now. So that 5% damage modifier on Legacy of the Void is pretty good and hard to pass up, in addition to the other things Legacy of the Void gives you. So likely still seeing that in Tomb. Good thing, bad thing, kind of depends on how you look at it. All right, so that is our tier bonuses. All right, guys, so in this section, we're going to go over talents, what has changed, what hasn't changed in 7.2.5. So this is all recent with the new build. The only thing that's really changed for us with this is Mindbender now generates double the insanity that it used to. So this is definitely the most impactful change that we're seeing right now. And for most parts, Mindbender is probably going to overtake Power Infusion as our new default choice, so to speak. The insanity generation you get is amazing, and essentially kind of smooths out your rotation so that you have Mindbender and Void Torrent every Void form, which kind of boils down to your Void forms are consistently 50-55 stacks each Void form. Just the way that things work out, which is really, really cohesive. It's great to play with. If you're reserved about going to Mindbender, I'd highly suggest going on PTR just to check it out. It's honestly, I have a lot of fun with it, so we'll see what happens. But and then our current choice in talents is mostly right now between AS and San Lan. That choice is still going to be somewhat relevant. We're still working out the exact point, but that will depend on your crit. It will depend on your mastery and the fight type. Generally speaking, San Lan's looking to still be barely better on pure single target or spread out targets, things like that. And AS kind of does better whenever you add a lot of targets in general. So we'll see. It's kind of hard to tell right now, but it will probably vary on the fight type and your gear still, same that it does in Nighthold. So that, as it stands right now, probably will not be changing. All right. Another choice that we have that we never really talked about too much is between Twist of Fate and Fortress of the Mind on our level 15 row. So with Twist of Fate is just pretty amazing on most everything. However, Fortress of the Mind was always pretty close, if not better, on absolute pure single target. Now that's not something that we talked about much, is mainly because with Nighthold, the single target fights that we had, which if they had anything single target related, they also had some kind of ads come out before then, essentially giving us more uptime on Twist of Fate than just when the boss goes below 35%. With that being said, Tomb of Sargeras is a different raid. There are bosses where it's literally just one boss the entire fight. There's no ads coming out to help you proc Twist of Fate. So for that reason, we're investigating Fortress of the Mind builds very heavily. So you're likely to see Fortress of the Mind being used over Twist of Fate in a situation where it is just pure single target, one boss, and not being able to proc Twist of Fate on any ads that are coming out before and that kind of thing. So look out for that being a little bit of a change that we have, a little bit of an extra toolkit addition that we have in Tomb of Sargeras. And the last thing as far as talents go that I'll cover here is Legacy of the Void versus Surrender to Madness. If you're not aware, the tier set, like I mentioned before, affects Legacy more than Surrender, right? We're getting more benefit out of our tier by using Legacy of the Void. The tier is nerfed for surrender. What this basically means is that Legacy will continue to remain the default choice. So just want to make that pretty clear. We're probably not going to use surrender at all for progression. Might still come back for that quick farm stuff when fights get shorter, but that's about it. That choice is pretty much still the same. All right, that pretty much wraps up talents. All right, guys. All right, next thing I want to cover in this video is trinkets. So this is something I didn't really talk about too much in earlier videos, but I do want to kind of go over a little bit of what I've messed around with on the PTR as far as trinkets go, because currently those are available for purchase on the vendors in there. If you want to go try these out, by all means go for it. There are vendors in, I believe, Dalrand and Ogremar if you want. Same with the tier sets if you like to purchase those. So I'm going to kind of go over the Tomb of Sargeras trinkets that we currently have and talk a little bit about them, and mostly in comparison to what we have now. So the main trinkets that we like using now from the Nighthold are Erratic Metronome and Whispers in the Dark. Grimoire that drops off of Crosis is also pretty solid in dungeons, but as far as raids go, it doesn't see much use. So if we look at those trinkets, which are kind of our staple, as well as stat sticks, I guess, let's kind of go by these trinkets and see how they stack up. So the first one is Charm of the Rising Tide. So this is kind of an interesting trinket in that it deals with movement. So while you remain stationary, gain X haste every second, stacking up to 10 times, which lasts 20 seconds. So the idea with this is you need to stay standing still for 10 seconds, and then you get a solid amount of haste. That's kind of the idea with the trinket. This actually could work a little bit better for Shadow than other classes, as we're kind of already used to standing still for a certain period of time, mainly with Void Torrent. So we're kind of already used to being able to plan our movements and that kind of thing. So this actually could end up working pretty well. It gives base intellect, which is good. Nothing really bad to say about that, so cool, I guess. I'm not quite sure how this is going to stack up against other trinkets, like Metronome and that kind of thing. On-use trinkets are always kind of tricky. The main thing that's giving me, it's kind of weird about this trinket is it's on a minute 30-second cooldown. So for Shadow Priest, this works good and bad. Minute 30 seconds means it will always be up, or should always be up if you're using it on cooldown with Shadow Fiend. So that's good. Shadow Fiend scales with haste. That's good. However, it doesn't line up with Power Infusion very well. In fact, if you don't line it up with Power Infusion, you could cost yourself a use of the trinket or two over the course of the fight, since Power Infusion is 2 minutes. So with that being said, it's hard to tell where this will fit in your rotation. However, if you use this like in a good spot in your Void form, you can actually extend your Void form. So let's say right now you're used to popping Power Infusion at 20 stacks. Well, now you could maybe use this trinket at 20 stacks and delay Power Infusion until 30-35 stacks, or something to that effect. So this can be used to kind of game your Void forms a little bit, and that's something I plan on investigating pretty heavily once we get our hands on more data and more fight type stuff to see how the movement's really going to play into it. So as far as my rating goes, right now it's kind of hard to tell, but it could be quite good. Alright, so the next one we'll look at is the Tarnished Sentinel Medallion. This trinket has base mastery, and it does an interesting effect. It essentially summons an owl that shoots your target with arcane bolts, and the more spells you put into that target, the owl has a chance to put out more bolts, basically. Which is a really weird trinket. We haven't really quite seen something like this. But it could work pretty well. The biggest thing about this trinket that I really love is that it's on a 2-minute cooldown, and it's an on-use trinket. So what does this mean? Yes, it's with Power Infusion. So this lines up perfectly with Power Infusion, which is great because not only is that one most of our damage is, but it's also the case of, since more attacks to the target have a chance to extend the owl's duration. That means that essentially when we're putting out our most spells, we're extending the duration as best as we can. So it lines up perfectly, and overall when I was doing testing with this trinket, it was definitely one of the better ones that I noticed in terms of flat damage. So even though doesn't scale with shadow damage, it's an arcane damage trinket, you'll probably see this a lot. I'm not quite sure if it's probably something I would take over something like Whispers in the Dark, purely because it's not as RNG dependent, but time will tell on this guy. Alright, next one we'll look at is the Spectral Thurible. Not quite sure how to say that. This is a versatility trinket, which is something we don't see quite often. And it has an equip effect where essentially spells have a chance to target a spear that hits the target. and cleaves targets that the spear hits. So I will say the animation of this trinket's actually pretty cool, and it's a shadow damage trinket. Um, I've been looking at this, and the more I look at it, it's basically just a different version of Icon of Rot that we saw from Tichondrius. So I don't expect this being used a whole lot, because Icon of Rot's not too crazy either. This might be okay depending on the fight. I know like Mistress from Tomb of Sargeras is kind of a little bit of cleave in there, so might see some use there, but probably won't see this too much in terms of progression rating. So next thing we look at is Terror from Below. This is a trinket that essentially summons a shark randomly sometimes that does damage to things in the area. So yeah, the animation's alright, I guess. There's that. It gives us base crit, which is fine. We'll probably want crit, like I said, pretty equal to mastery, so that's good. As far as damage goes, I mean, it was doing a solid amount of damage when I was testing it on the PTR, but it's really hard to say. It splits its damage against targets, so this might be more like a better thing on single target if you want priority damage, but for instance, on a fight like Botanist, obviously Botanist isn't in Tomb of Sargeras, but where on Mythic, their health resets. So it cleaving to other targets isn't always a good thing. So it's not necessarily a trinket I would choose to use all the time, but could be okay in some use cases. So I'm not sure. I don't really know how I feel about this. I wouldn't expect to see it a whole lot, but it is all right, I guess. And the last one is the trinket that drops off of Killed Jaden. So this is the Tome of Unraveling Sanity. This trinket's pretty bad. I don't know what it was, but when I was testing on the PTR, it just seemed to do very little damage at all. It gives us base intellect. It's got a very weird effect. It's an on use where you apply a dot to an enemy that stacks itself every 2 seconds. After a whole minute, the corruption then deals damage, which is kind of weird. And then it inflicts a big amount of shadow damage. Now, if the target dies while they're corrupted, they explode with their stacks and it cleaves and stuff like that. So it could be okay in dungeons, I guess. And it has a 1 minute cooldown. So it lines up with everything, so there's that. But the weird thing about this trinket is it scales with haste, which is kind of strange. But I don't think we've seen a trinket that scales with haste. So essentially, the more haste you have, the more damage the trinket does, just like a dot would. So it's kind of interesting. I guess you can kind of line it up a little bit with your void form and that kind of thing. But when we were testing this, it was just the damage is pretty mediocre, and it just didn't seem to do a whole lot. So I don't know. Time will kind of tell on this thing, but in my opinion, this is probably the worst trinket out of the bunch, and it drops from Killed Jaden, so they might still be tweaking this guy. So who knows? We'll see. But that's all the trinkets we have from Tomb of Sargeras, guys. So we'll see what happens. All right. So real quick, I want to discuss Legendaries a little bit. I know we've been getting some questions about, what's going on with the Legendary rankings. Are things going to be changing? Do I need to look at prioritizing, looking at getting this Legendary or that Legendary? Essentially, what we're looking at now is more single target legendaries. We've run a lot of stuff to kind of figure out where things lie, and for the most part, all signs are kind of pointing to having the belt or having the cloak is a pretty good idea because of how single target heavy Tomb is. It's not saying that belt and cloak are going to be best on every fight. That still remains to be seen. Cephas is still going to be really, really solid if you can proc it. Again, we're not quite sure which bosses you can proc it and where. It definitely does seem that Cephas won't be as easy to proc as it was in Nighthold bosses, but there are still some where it's pretty lucrative, like Mistress is a really good Cephas fight and things like that. So kind of TLDR this a little bit. You're still going to want Cephas if you can proc it reliably. And then outside of that, you pretty much have like a really solid pack in the middle there, I guess, with shoulders, belt, cloak, and even things like Pridaz and the new chest. Pridaz is actually pretty solid now when you think about it, because upgrading Pridaz to 970, if that's something you end up doing, you're getting a lot of stats from that, and just the raw stat output's nice until we get like a better neck that's relative to Pridaz. So what I mean by that is Pridaz gets better, and every legendary gets better the worse your off piece is. So let's say you have a 900 neck, and then you have like a 925 shoulder piece. Well, that could make Pridaz look better than the shoulders purely because the item difference is so large between your neck and your shoulders. Something to keep in mind. So generally speaking, any of those that I just mentioned are kind of the top ones you want to look at. With the wrist still being decent on heavy multi-target, it still has that niche, but I think if I had to guess, we're probably going to use belt Cephas like we are now in Nighthold, where we can proc Cephas. And then whenever we can't proc Cephas, you're probably going to look at using belt shoulders. And the reason why I think you're going to see more use out of the shoulders is people stopped using it a lot in Nighthold, mainly because the shoulders tier was one of our best itemized pieces. Well, in tier 20, if you don't already know, the shoulders are probably our worst itemized piece in terms of tier, which kind of buffs the shoulders in a way, because you're really never fighting for that tier slot unless it's the only piece of tier that you have. So I'm not saying that the shoulders are more valuable than foreset, but if you have your choice between which tier pieces to equip, you're probably not going to use the shoulders, which kind of means equipping the legendary shoulders, you're not losing a valuable itemized tier piece. So that's kind of my prediction and what we've seen so far. We'll see what happens. We'll have more stuff released later on, but that is legendaries. Alright guys, so the last thing that we're going to talk about in this video is our new legendaries. So in this patch, we're actually getting 2 new legendaries. One of them is a class general one, so all priests are getting this on their loot table, and the other one is a specific Shadow Priest legendary. So we'll go ahead and talk about the first one, which is our new legendary ring. It's called Soul of the High Priest. This is the one that's shared between all 3 specs. So for these specs, you get the spell Twist of Fate baseline, essentially. So what this means is you don't take Twist of Fate with this ring. You get to choose another one of the options and get Twist of Fate addition to that. So that means you can take, in our case, Fortress of the Mind or Shadowward Void, and with the ring, still have Twist of Fate. That's at its most basic level what it's doing right now. So on paper, if you just think about the effect, this could be really, really strong. However, there's not just the effect we have to consider with these legendaries. There's also the point of it is replacing a piece of gear that we currently have. So what I mean by that is the actual stats on the ring also need to contribute to the overall gain of the legendary, because you'll always have other pieces of gear that you could replace it with. So in the case of the ring, it has crit haste and mastery on it in addition to stamina, and 1 socket on it. When you add up all these stats together, it kind of puts it at middle of the pack level. It's not quite at the amount of stats you get from, say, using the Twins Painful Touch ring or Cephas Secret. So it's a little bit on the low side, but it has a decent effect. For the most part, when we did testing with the ring, Fortress of the Mind pretty much always beat out Shadowward Void, especially when we look at longer fights and things like that. So if we look at it from that standpoint, when you're taking Fortress of the Mind with this ring, you're looking at barely middle of the pack legendary compared to all of our other ones. Maybe like 3 to 4% ballpark at best in terms of overall damage increase, stats, and effects alike. And when you take Shadowward Void, it's like sometimes a negative DPS loss, or maybe even just a couple percent. It's really nothing crazy. So in general, I know myself and other people in the Shadow Priest community are hoping that the ring gets more stats added to it to kind of offset that a little bit. We'll see what happens. They could always change this as times go on. They've already buffed the stats on the ring once in the most recent build, but I'm not sure if they're going to do it again. So as it stands right now, it is still on our loot table and things like that, so you have just as equal chance of getting this as you do any other legendary for us. So it's definitely not one to be desired, though, unfortunately. You'd pretty much rather have any other legendary that we have on our loot table. Alright, so real quick, I'm going to do a deeper dive into the legendary chest that's being added in the game. So it's called Heart of the Void, and what it does is essentially increases the damage of our Void Eruption by 300%. Which effectively, you multiply your current damage of Void Eruption by 4. And that's kind of how the math works out there. Which is a pretty solid DPS increase just based on numbers. I know Void Eruption is on a whole lot of our damage, but that's still a solid, couple percent increase. And one of the best parts about this legendary is that the chest actually has really, really good stats for us. Crit and haste are probably going to be one of our 2 best, if not first and third, depending on AS versus Sand Lane. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of raids, you probably won't see it used a whole lot. But in dungeons, it's going to be very, very, very good. And if it's one of your first legendaries, it's also pretty solid performance in raids. It's not top tier, it's not at the bottom. It's like almost exactly right there in the middle, kind of right next to the wrist, the trinket, even up there with Prides and things like that. So don't be too discouraged if this is a legendary that you get. It's actually pretty decent. It's not our best in slot or anything crazy like that, but still pretty solid overall. Alright guys, the next thing we're going to look at this video is Relics. Alright, so real quick, not a whole lot's changing with Relics. If you're taking Sand Land or AS, the one thing you will notice is the value of Touch of Darkness legendaries, or Relics, sorry, will go down slightly because we don't have tier 19 anymore. But again, that doesn't change a whole lot. That mainly impacts the build that we're using, more so than ever, but the main thing that's going to be changing with all this new stuff is Fiending Dark. We will have a Fiending Dark relic available. Currently, the only one that I believe is in the game is a Blood Relic off of Killed Jaden in Tomb of Sargeras. And at the moment, if you're taking the Mindbender build, you're likely to see Fiending Dark be your best in the slot. At the moment, it seems to be worth about 4 item levels on the actual weapon, which is far and beyond our best in slot relic. So who knows if they're going to add more, but that's currently the state of things. As far as other relics, the Mind Blast relics seem to be doing slightly better. Again, not by much, but slightly better, partially because of the 2-piece and how that works. But everything else is pretty much exactly the same. So don't expect your relics to change out too much there. Alright, and that wraps up this video. I think I've covered most of the things that are changing for us currently in the build. We might see more changes as time goes on. We have about 2 weeks left until the patch actually hits, and I think 3 weeks until Tomb of Sargeras actually releases. So who knows? We still have some time until all this kind of settles down. If new things come out, I'll either address them in a new video or some kind of post will be linked in the description, so look out for that if you want the most up-to-date changes. Alright guys, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.